Thank you. Okay, let's start the last and not least session of this seminar. And we are going to talk about a topic that I think it has been an issue for several decades, maybe already now. But I am really curious because I have been for almost 10 years trying to find out what China is doing in the Mediterranean. And I really have no clue. I mean, the thing is that I have heard a lot. I have seen them in the Mediterranean, so I have seen Chinese in the Mediterranean in several countries. I can imagine the role, but there were, until very recently, there were no real thorough studies on the topic. So I think this is very relevant because we might finally find out what China is doing in the Mediterranean, what are the sort of links, relations. We know something about economy, but we know very little about political dimensions of this relationship. And with this panel, the thing is that we will be able to see it from different perspectives, from the northern shore, from the southern shore, but also from the eastern shore. And this is, I think, one of the main virtues of this panel, which is dealing with a topic that is widely uncovered, and at the same time, having different perspectives on the same topic. So with no more further ado, I will give the floor to the speakers today in this panel. I will start with Mr. Anastas Vangeli, who is Associate Researcher of the Torino World Affairs Institute, and he will deal with the Balkans in the context of China's Mediterranean vision. I would really appreciate it if you could stick more or less to the 20-minute time allocated, and then we will have the opportunity to have some question and answer between us and the rest of the audience. Okay, Mr. Vangeli, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First, thanks for having me here, and thanks for the impeccable organization of the conference. My name is Anastas Vangeli. I'm otherwise a doctoral researcher at the Polish Academy of Science in Warsaw, and I'm also currently a civil society scholar of the Open Society Foundation, but I'm here in the capacity of an associate researcher at the Torino World Affairs Institute, where I contribute to a very interesting project called IEMed, very appropriately. And later on I'll provide on the slides the link. You can check out the project where we have actually a huge database, not just raw data on China-Mediterranean cooperation, but also we tried to get different perspectives from China and from the different countries. And we translate the original sources into English, so they're accessible to researchers. Anyway, of course, the Mediterranean is a very large region, so within ChinaMed, we have different sections of the Mediterranean where I'm in charge of the Balkan section. And by Balkan, I mean not just the Western Balkans, but also the wider Balkan region, including Greece, even some would say Turkey, and so on. Though here today, given the time constraints and what I know best, I'll focus mostly on the Western Balkans. And I was informed that the audience is not here, and of course this is a Mediterranean forum, so the audience is not too much into China, so if you'll forgive me that I'll briefly have to give the background, so I also make the work easier for the participants later. So when we talk about China today, we have to take in account the trajectory of China as a global actor, which is, of course, you cannot talk about it without talking about the Chinese economic miracle or the China's trajectory following 1978. In 1978, roughly, the Chinese leadership initiated the process of reform and opening up. Long story short, by getting foreign capital into the country, by focusing on industrialization, developing strong production capacities, adopting export-oriented strategy, China has managed to basically achieve double-digit growth for close to 3 decades, and only recently has been slowing down to a new normal, so-called, which is still pretty high, above 6.5% GDP growth annually, which has allowed China to become a very comfortable actor on the global stage, currently second largest economy, largest trader, one of the largest investors overseas, largest holder of currency reserves, and the rest is, you can also see it more and more in the news. Some particular events that catalyzed the rise of China on the global stage in the 21st century was the accession to the World Trade Organization. Basically, in 2001, China entered the World Trade Organization, and the expectation by the West was that this would lead to China adopting more liberal approach and adjusting to the global rules. What happened is, on the very short term, China got an immense boost in terms of trade, which led to even further growth, but it didn't lead to China adopting fully the Western rules, which we can talk about that later. The global financial crisis, which had terrible effects, especially on the northern Mediterranean shore, in this country included, left China relatively unscathed because of the large stimulus package the Chinese government provided. And more even so, in the aftermath of the crisis, China emerged as one of the largest creditors to developing nations, but also as one of the actors, for instance, in the operation to save the Eurozone. And of course, the emergence of protectionist, nationalist, isolationist sentiments in the West, which kind of culminated with the election of Donald Trump, has further boosted China's status on the international stage as the largest country that promotes some kind of globalization and some kind of trade and linkages. The person who is now the undisputed leader of China, the President Xi Jinping, recently in the news there was the information that there is no more term limit, so he's likely to serve, now he's starting the second term, he's probably going to serve third term, we'll see for more. Anyway, Xi Jinping has become the symbol of this new position of China on the global stage. Basically, if China before had a policy of keeping a low profile, that was especially a result of the Tiananmen events and the pressures from the West. Under Xi Jinping, China regains its confidence and inaugurated a policy that Chinese scholars call striving for achievement, which is based on the idea of adjusting the role of China in the global economy and outgrowing the export-led model into a more in a model based on state investment and development. Basically renegotiating also a lot of the linkages with other parts of the world from short-term profits to long-term economic strategy, offering a particular idea how things can be solved abroad, or what is called offering Chinese wisdom to others. And of course, a diplomatic practice that is accompanied by building new institutions, new mechanisms, and new platforms that engage other actors on Chinese terms. And this is where we come to the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think is probably the best way to approach China's Mediterranean vision and China's policy in the Balkans. The Belt and Road Initiative is a very comprehensive foreign policy endeavor that was initiated officially in 2013 with a speech by Xi Jinping in Kazakhstan, where he announced the Silk Road Economic Belt, which refers to the construction of very complex economic corridors across the Eurasian landmass. And very soon after, in Indonesia, he announced the Maritime Silk Road, which refers to building maritime linkages from the Pacific through the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The Belt and Road was developing in the next few years. Last year, there was the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, which kind of positioned Belt and Road as a proto-international organization. And soon after, it was also codified in the constitution of the Communist Party, meaning that's one of the national priorities for China. There are different debates on the terminology, how to call the Belt and Road. What is important out of this thing that I've singled out, the Chinese insist on the term initiative, and some of them call it proposal, which refers to idea that this is something that is still open-ended and has the possibility to be modified, and that it's not something that China imposes onto others. And therefore, there is a dislike among Chinese experts for the term strategy, because it has connotations that sound a bit militaristic or cunning or whatnot. And of course, Belt and Road is not a project, but it's actually a lot of projects combined, meaning that there's difference what the Belt and Road means, let's say, in Pakistan, and what it means in Greece, and what it means in Hungary, and what it means in Africa. In some places, it's focused more on development aid, some places it's focused more on trade, some places it's ports, and so on. And there is debate whether the Belt and Road is some kind of a counterpart of the Marshall Plan. Of course, the Belt and Road is much larger in terms of scope and in terms of finance, and is happening in a different context. Another thing is how new is the Belt and Road. If you dwell actually in the policies, in the concrete projects, you can find that a lot of these things were happening before the Belt and Road was announced. So in a way, this is more of the Belt and Road as such is a rhetorical figure to basically give a name to what China has been doing. And these are the geographical areas. This is one of the maps. The important thing is there is no one definite map issued by Chinese authorities, what is the Belt and Road, because, as I said, it's very open-ended. This is one of the maps. Of course, to add, to this you should add also Latin America, you should add the Arctic, because these are also areas where China is considering to build the Belt and Road. Of course, the Mediterranean Sea is pretty important. And it's very, I'll skip the part about the logic. It's very important that when we talk about China and Mediterranean, we should take into account the Chinese vision of the Mediterranean. And it's basically a vision of an enlarged region. So basically for China, the Mediterranean starts in the Indian Ocean. And then the Gulf of Aden, Djibouti is, let's say, one of the entrance points. Djibouti is a place where China has already built a military base. And when it comes, let's say, to the northern shore, where does the Mediterranean end? As I'll talk in a bit, it's the Balkans, but for them, it's not separable, let's say, from Central Europe, and it's not separable even from the rest of Europe. So it's not a vision of the Mediterranean based on a certain closed understanding, but it's more of a region that is expanding. And it's more about, when they talk about the Mediterranean, it's more about shifting the gravity back to the Mediterranean. Because, I mean, historically, this was the area with a lot of linkages and a lot of transportations. The central feature of the Belt and Road, very importantly, is connectivity. So this whole initiative is about building linkages or rebuilding linkages, as I said, shifting the points of gravity of economic and political relations. So by connectivity, usually what's in the news is, of course, infrastructure. But if you analyze the documents and the policies of China, it's also about connectivity of markets, connectivity of people, connectivity, importantly, of ideas, facilities, businesses, and so on. And when we talk about the infrastructure development as one of the landmarks of the Chinese new diplomacy, we have to also refer to the Chinese development logic and rhetoric. So very often the Chinese government officials would say, if you want to develop, you should build the roads first. And this is not something new. This is, you can also see it in many other schools of economic thought. But this is something they really emphasize, because it was also the case with China. It could not embark on the economic miracle without investing in infrastructure. Information technologies play a big role in this new strategy, including e-commerce, which is another thing that China is championing, and so on. And of course, the creation of economy of scale, especially in regions such as the Balkans, as we come shortly, where there's a lot of small divided countries. The idea is that they cannot be engaged in any economic cooperation on their own. They have to be part of something big. And of course, this is not contradictory to what's been happening in Europe in the last more than half a century, building a joint market. And importantly, when we talk about, let's say, the Mediterranean, is the interpretation. So when usually you talk about the Mediterranean in different venues, there is the idea, aside from the historical interpretations, when it comes to current affairs, it's all about conflict, it's about refugees, it's about wars. But for China, these are topics that are on the side. The main thing is, let's see how we can make business, how we can do economic potentials and build linkages. And of course, it's very important to know that whatever China does now and labels Belt and Road has been taking place for a while now, as mentioned earlier. The particularity of the northern shore, which is the European shore of the Mediterranean, is that there is increased diplomacy with focus on the Belt and Road. I mean, there is in general increased diplomacy between China and these countries, which especially dates back to the Eurozone. At least in the case of Greece, that was the time when the debt crisis pushed the Greek government to explore opportunities, and China was one of the sources of capital. So this was a very important turning point. And after the crisis, there was very big demand for capital in this part of Europe, including Italy, Spain, and this is when Chinese investors were coming in increased numbers. The specific projects of the Belt and Road is ports. So everyone probably heard about the Piraeus port in Greece, a major acquisition by the state-owned enterprise COSCO from China, but COSCO has been active in pursuing deals elsewhere in the Mediterranean. So in Spain, you had the Noatum ports, one of the ports in Valencia, and I don't know which other cities, where now I think the majority stake is owned by COSCO. There's the 5 Ports Alliance between Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia. So it's Trieste, Venice, Kopar, and a couple of others. And of course, the focus is not just on ports, but also linking the ports to the landmass, so the intermodal transportation. So it's not also building railways from the ports, highways, and so on. Another pillar is the acquisition of companies and technology, especially in the developed European economies, setting up own research centers and people-to-people exchange, which involves a lot of areas. Tourism is one thing, which I think is particularly important, at least in Spain, but also education, think tanks, and so on. The Balkans as a particular region within China's Mediterranean vision. Usually you don't talk about the Balkans in the context of Mediterranean, and usually you don't talk about the Balkans in the context of global economic linkages. And this is the important change that China brings to the table, but say by involving the Balkan countries in various forms of cooperation focused on boosting economic linkages. Moreover, the Balkans is framed by China as a region of exceptional importance because it is not only part of the Mediterranean strategy, but it's also part of another initiative China is pursuing in Eastern Europe, which is called 16+1, is a cooperation with a lot of post-socialist countries, 16 of them, based on the certain structural similarities, also inspired by the history of cooperation they had before 1989. So a lot of the post-communist countries of the Balkans are also involved in that initiative. Of course, when you talk about the Balkan region, one thing that comes to the mind, at least in economic terms, is underdevelopment. According to a recent study of the IEMed, huge infrastructure gap, and this is where the interests of the Balkan countries and China come together. So there is a complementarity between the two sides, at least in the realm of infrastructure development. When you talk about the Balkans, you also often have the narrative of the Balkans as an area of competition of different global powers. You had the US having a particular role after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Of course, the Balkan countries are either EU members or candidate for EU membership, so the EU, Western Europe, Germany in particular is an important actor. Recently we hear a lot about Russia. Turkey is there during because of the historical linkages and interests, but you know, China is different. All these actors discuss strategic issues, high politics, very often ethnic issues, and again, this is something that is not part of the Chinese discourse, which is strictly economic in nature. And the way China has been developing the cooperation with the Balkan countries is again different from all other actors, which have used not only strategic linkages, but also various forms of conditionality, especially EU and the US, and have basically explored when it comes to, let's say, the international financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, have provided a development model also based on sticks and carrots and imposed reforms that were not organic, but you know, based on external inputs. So in the case of China, all these ideas, all these projects have been negotiated in a rather low-key manner, at least in their public portrayal. So it's more about the socialization of political elites, think tank elites, and a lot of symbolic power based on ceremonial, ritualistic meetings, especially when it comes to the 16+1 cooperation. Just a quick information about it. I don't know how much time do we? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. The 16+1, I think, is important when we talk about the Balkans, because it's one of these novel Chinese institutions, which, as I said, I can quickly name the 16 countries that are part of it: Albania, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Macedonia, Montenegro, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Serbia, Slovenia, and I missed one. Moldova is not. Because it's considered to be part of the Russian sphere of interest. These are all EU members or potential EU members. So Romania, Poland, of course. Yeah. Anyway, so this is a platform that has emerged quite surprisingly in 2012 and has ever since developed through annual summits and a lot of sectorial dialogues in a very quasi-institutional way. And this is a blueprint for the Chinese institution building, basically. And it's much more developed compared, let's say, to the platform that China has for cooperation with Africa or with Latin America. And the goal has been to achieve various ways of policy coordination and facilitation of different measures with the goal to boost economic flows. So basically you have, after the crisis, China realized that something had to change because these countries reached their maximum in the relations with China. So one way has been to do what they know best. Okay, get the governments together and see what policy measures can be taken to, let's say, boost trade, boost investment, and create new opportunities, synergies, and so on. At the same time, it has been established before the Belt and Road, which also had the purpose of serving as a laboratory. So if you see how the Belt and Road is being developed, it has followed a lot of the logic of 16+1. And the Balkan countries have had a particular role in 16+1 because they're not EU member states, the Western Balkan countries at least. So they have been much more flexible in terms of the legislation and the measures undertaken. What cannot be done, let's say, in the EU can be done in these countries for China. So this is the map of 16+1. There are also observer countries. Greece is one. Probably Italy should be by now considered observer. Austria as well. So it's a very important regional initiative, which I think is inseparable from the relations with the Mediterranean as well. I mean, aside from the fact that it involves the Adriatic coast, it's as I said, for China, everything is intertwined, so you cannot see one thing without taking account the other. It's not like, I think that's one of the important paradigmatic differences. In Europe, everything is kind of separated, and for China, everything is a holistic thing. And some of the key concepts, I said the economic orientation, which is a complete reframing of the region. Again, the Balkans is just the mentioning of the Balkans is already arousing certain ideas in people's heads. But for China, what the Balkans has to do with completely different things. An important thing is the expected proactive participation. And this is important because these countries are countries that have for 25 years followed the policies of IMF, World Bank. They have invested everything in integrating EU, NATO. So they didn't really have an opportunity to develop independent foreign policy or just to think of themselves as part of the world. And now they have to do that by dealing with China. In the process, China is providing them with equal treatment despite the huge asymmetry. So again, for the non-EU member states, it's actually a privilege to sit on an equal footing, not only with China, but also with other EU countries, because they are otherwise considered not Europe in EU. Again, a region that has been considered economic periphery now is reframed as an important land bridge intersection. That's also a novelty. We discussed about the build the roads first concept. Production capacity cooperation is another idea. Basically, this refers to the potential economic deals by pooling together resources. For example, a lot of these countries have devastated economic capacities, rusty economic capacities. China has the know-how and the capital, and there is also an opportunity here to involve Europe. So that's why there is this triple win idea that basically we can use what's there to create new opportunities. The landmark project of China and the Balkans, which is also one of the landmark projects of the Belt and Road and China's new diplomacy in general. After the acquisition of the Piraeus port, there is this idea to connect Athens to Budapest by high-speed rail. And here is the map. And it's a very important map because if you don't see this could be also a map of something else. This could be the Balkan route of migrants, right? Again, this, for me, in analysis, this visible element of reinterpreting the region has been a very important novelty brought by China. Anyway, so there is a lot of talk, of course, a lot of policy hurdles, but also a lot of pressures along the way of establishing this China-Europe Land Sea Express route, which is, we can maybe discuss it a bit later, because I think I'm running out of time. Highways, very important, pan-European corridors that are kind of left out by EU are now built with funds from China, which of course brings an important risk of debt trap. And I think we can address maybe these questions, why EU has problems with China in the Balkans in the discussion. I'm sorry for overstepping the time limit. Because what I presented is from the perspective of China, maybe from the perspective of the Balkan countries, but seen from Brussels, this is very often problematized. And I'll just go quickly through the four arguments. One idea is that the new economic architecture that China is proposing is basically messing up with the existing architecture in Europe. So let's say if you talk to Dutch people, they say, yeah, it's very good that China is building Piraeus and the routes in the Balkans, but what does it imply for the Netherlands? What does it imply for Rotterdam? Or the same thing here in Hamburg. When it comes to all these projects, I didn't explain the tight model of financing, but basically these projects, the construction of railways, highways, are all carried out by Chinese companies. And this is basically taking away business from European companies. And this is another line of concern. Investing in European companies now is considered a security issue, especially with the acquisition. This doesn't refer so much to the Balkans, but let's say to the other parts of the European shore of the Mediterranean. Investing in robotics, investing in high technology is considered a security question. And in the Balkans, acquiring some smaller capacities is also considered intercepting supply chains, which is in the new discourse in Europe a security issue. The state-led development model and economic cooperation by states is considered to confront the market-driven model and opens questions about transparency and so on. And of course, there is the perennial question in Europe, how to speak on China with one voice. If different parts of Europe develop different understanding and have different interests with China, it's very hard to have one voice. Again, I apologize for overstepping the time limit. I'd be very willing to discuss much more in the Q&A session. Thank you very much. This is the link to the ChinaMed project if you are interested.
Thank you, Anastas, and we will get back to your ideas afterwards during the Q&A. Now, the floor is for Yusra Taha. She's professor of political sciences in the Cairo University, and she has been working quite extensively, as far as I know, on Chinese-Egyptian relations and their common characteristics, common elements, if there are any. So, Yusra, when you want.
Can you tell me how to start the slideshow?
It's to launch it.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. It gives me so much pleasure and honor to be a part of the distinguished panelists in the Institute tonight. As our distinguished chair has mentioned, I will be addressing the Chinese-Egyptian relations and to what extent they have any Mediterranean characteristics. The plan of my presentation, or the focus of my presentation, would be on Chinese-Egyptian relations in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, starting 2011. The speech would highlight the obvious hype that has been witnessed in the relations. It would try to address the reasons and the drivers behind such development and such hype. It's also going to shed light on the challenges and the prospects of growth those relations have, and the potentials of growth it's expected to reach. I also try to frame all that in the context of China's Mediterranean presence and policies within the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, as my colleague Anastas has mentioned. And in the end, I have attempted to examine whether all of this reflect any kind of Mediterranean aspects or not. So again, just a quick note, what is the Belt and Road Initiative? It's exactly like what Anastas has mentioned. It's an initiative mentioned in 2013. It definitely has different kinds of maps and demonstrations. This is one of them. The red represents the land route, and the purple line represents the maritime route. So it's basically a proposition of China to reinvent the traditional Silk Road and start to connect people from different parts of the world. It's part of China's policy of outreach and going out to the outer world rather than focusing internally on itself. We will come back to this map later in the presentation. Yet, if we would quickly move on to the China and Egypt relations and what is the shape of those relations. It's been known since the uprisings of 2011 that Egypt has suffered severe economic decline and major security threats in the aftermath of 2011. And this led Egypt to actually focus internally in an attempt to try to restore its stability and economic balance. And as a result, this actually imposed serious limitations on its flexibility and regional agility. Egypt has lost most of its regional influence on other countries and has been forced to focus internally to develop again and revive its economy. This actually what brought China and Egypt together. They are complementing their own interests. Egypt wants to restore its economy and China wants to invest more. And as a result, China has been a consistent partner of Egypt despite the, what happened in 2011. China did not abandon Egypt or decide not to invest in the country despite the threats and the challenges that were facing any foreign investor at the time. And this is due to many reasons, actually. The first is that Egypt is responsible for the control of the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal has a very important role in international trade since it's a major stop on the maritime Silk Road. Without the Suez Canal, most of the international trade would have to flow through the Cape of Goodwill. And this is very costly in terms of time and in terms of prices. And as a result, it has a very strategic role in enforcing and developing the maritime Silk Road. It provides safe and constant passage for China's vessels. And China has a constant belief in the role that Egypt can play in promoting China's trade with Africa and fortifying this trade. So as a result, China and Egypt, again, like Anastas was mentioning, as a description to China's approach to the Mediterranean, they succeeded or they attempt to complement their needs with each other. Egypt has developed its own national development plan, and China has developed its own foundations and goals from the Belt and Road Initiative, and their work basically was about complementing both needs and interests together. They try to figure out where their both needs meet, and they implement the projects that, that reflect those needs. So if we start initially by the different areas of cooperation that China and Egypt have started to actually explore and implement, I would start by the economic aspect of cooperation. This is the largest and most expanded area of cooperation between both countries. From the economic aspect, since President Sisi came to power, he has taken onto his shoulders the major mega project of the new capital, or the mega infrastructure projects, which is the new administrative capital of Egypt. It's a huge project that he believes has a potential to develop and promote foreign investment in Egypt. And as you see in the image, it's a huge area that has various different kinds of activities, 4 square kilometers of theme parks, 90 square kilometers of energy farms, 315 square kilometers of developed land, and 15 square kilometers of airport areas. It's a very, very ambitious plan, attempting to move or to elevate the pressure of the original capital of Cairo into this new administrative capital. President Sisi has been attempting to attract investments for this administrative capital, initially from the Emirates, but this did not work, so the Chinese have entered heavily in this area, and they're actually the ones responsible for building the central business districts, 5.6 square kilometers in the new capital. They are the ones who are responsible for achieving that project. So the Egyptians are trying to convince the Chinese to invest more in that area, but still this is the only thing that is finalized now. If we move on to different aspects of economic cooperation as well, there is increased cooperation in terms of energy and electricity. Basically, in September 2017, both parties have agreed to carry out national electricity transmission grid of Egypt. China has started to invest more in energy, in electricity transmission, and in green energy as well, and new renewable energies in the country. So the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has decided to develop or build 11 greenfield solar power plants, and also there's another project, energy project, that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and China has agreed to establish in Egypt, which is the 3 solar photovoltaic power plants in southern Egypt of Aswan, because Egypt is like 8 months during the year of a summer, so our solar energy is very abundant, and as a result, China, Egypt, and with the help of Saudi Arabia, they started to invest in solar energy in the country. If we move on to different aspects and areas of economic cooperation, they extend to include everything, honestly. In transportation, they have agreed to establish a train between this new administrative capital and to connect it to the rest of Egypt and to connect it to the old capital. There's also different deals with BYD to have 16 electronic buses to introduce the idea of electronic buses in Egypt. In tourism, Egypt has become the 14th most preferable country or destination by China. So more and more tourists are coming from China to Egypt, and it's again a resemblance to China's approach in the north by promoting people-to-people exchange, like what Anastasia was mentioning. In terms of trade, China is Egypt's greatest trade partner. If we take a look at this link, you'd find that 13% of Egypt's exports come from China, and the rest is from the different parts of the world. So China is Egypt's first actually trade partner. We export many different products from China. It like the whole wide spectrum. Not necessarily one certain kind of product. Investment has reached $10 billion in 2016. Operating companies has risen from 30 to 100, and the finance sector, which is a very important agreement, they've achieved a currency swap of $2.6 billion, and Egypt has received $500 million in loans from the China Development Bank. So as you can see, it's very extensive in most of the areas. Then one of the most important projects as well is China's investment in the Suez Canal corridor. This is the Suez Canal, mainly a man-made canal that connects the Red Sea with the Mediterranean. Both countries has agreed to develop the cities on the canal, starting from Suez to Ismailia and Port Said. Those are the main cities on the canal, and China has been the largest investor in this area, establishing more and more different kinds of development projects. And of course, the TIDA, which is the Special Economic and Industrial Zone. It's the first Chinese community in the region. It includes various different kinds of projects, glass fiber companies, industrial, high and low voltage electrical industrial park, textile garment industries, oil equipment industrial park, and this economic zone is booming. It's expanding. It's expected to reach 20 square kilometers with more and more investments and more employment facilities. If we move on to the next aspect of cooperation, the cultural and identity-based cooperation, they have established in 2013 the Chinese Egyptian University. Supposedly, it will graduate students maybe this year. Student exchanges are booming and rising to a great extent. And the Hui and Uyghur Chinese Muslims, they study in Al-Azhar. The numbers have reached 1,000 to 2,000 students. China has been investing in technical education in Egypt, training Egyptian workers in IT and information technology kind of industries. They've agreed as well to offer 500 scholarships for Egyptian students, and of course the Confucius Institute graduating from 4,000 to 5,000 Egyptian students a year. So China has been, extensively invading Egyptian market, and Egypt has been accepting such investment with an open heart. If we go on to the political and economic and security cooperation, it's the least kind of cooperation that both countries is considering. Both of them are not interested in the political aspects of cooperation, as we will see in the aspects of China's approach to the North Africa or to the southern Mediterranean countries. It's devoid of conditionality. They don't care what's the kind of your political system. They don't care what kind of violations that you have inside. So the only initiative that China took was a kind of expression and explanation to how the Communist Party works in China, how one-party system operates, and if Egypt is willing to learn from the experience, then they would be happy to advocate their success in the one-party system to Egypt, but without any kind of pressure or force. In security, there's extensive, of course, cooperation in terms of telecommunications and satellites. They plan to invest in providing Egypt with its second satellite. And of course, there's the information exchange and cooperation in terms of counterterrorism, which unfortunately led to the detaining of 200 Uyghur students from the Uyghur ethnicity of China, who were studying in Al-Azhar in July 2017 because of allegations of counterterrorism. They've been taken and they've been detained. Most of them have been returned to China, but some of them remain unattended to. Such kind of relations, they of course face different challenges and limitations. Those include the economic challenges, of course, that we've mentioned in the aftermath of 2011, political turmoil and instability in Egypt, which has been reduced and controlled to a great extent, terrorism and extremism, especially in northern of Sinai, the corruption and the lack of transparency and clarity in some of Egypt's legal and regulatory principles, especially in customs and contract diffractions. The very long, of course, and complicated bureaucratic procedures that any investor has to go through in Egypt to establish companies or start any kind of business. Yet again, the Egyptian government is trying to reduce that and work on it. Still, there is the rising suspicious and lack of trust many Egyptian governing circles have towards the external world. And the last kind of challenge or limitation would be China's lack of international experience in internationalizing its business. China is still learning about the countries that it's going out to or reaching out to. It still doesn't understand the nature of the culture, the nature of the business, and as a result, there has been some delay in promoting its businesses and in this region and with Egypt. There are various suggested means to better improve those relations, including the exchange of views, the standardized mechanism for trade facilitation, simplifying of procedures, making it easier to establish businesses everywhere. There's also many recommendations for China to increase its non-financial investments and in focusing more on on modernizing the industrial system in Egypt. To have more focus on small industries and microeconomic income generating, because most of the cooperation or the economic cooperation is basically in infrastructure. It's not profit generating, it's not income generating. It relies on loans and increases the debt on the Egyptian economy, which actually imposes like a burden on the future generations. Of course, technical assistance and investing in Egyptian labor force rather than Chinese labor force. If we move on to China's Mediterranean policies and presence in the region, I would agree with what Anastase has mentioned, that China's presence and policy in the region is part of its Belt and Road Initiative, and the main goal would be to revive the traditional concept and aspects of the historical Silk Road in a modern and globalized sense. It's a manifestation, as I said, to China's new approach of going out and reaching out to the outer world. And the basic aim of China's Belt and Road Initiative and its presence in the Middle East, its attempt to rely less on foreign elements, to increase its global influence and to boost international commerce and boost China's place in have China put China in its proper place in the international arena. The main target actually of the Belt and Road Initiative is the European and the American markets, and as a result, the Mediterranean is actually a central hub. So the Mediterranean for China is actually a target. It's a destination it's a junction for China's trade and goods and a very strategic spot and connection to help China reduce the costs and the price and time of its goods reaching either the US or Europe in general. And it's a chance for China to reach to the European markets, which is something that China has been looking forward to for a very long time. China's Mediterranean approach could be divided into different aspects. China approaches the south in a slightly different manner than it approaches the north. In China's attempts to approach the south, by the south I mean countries of the southern Mediterranean, it's basically aiming at fostering further economic growth. Because the countries of the South Mediterranean, they have a high demand for equipment, high demand for construction. That's because of their large size, their large territory, their low engineering level skills, their low development skills, their large demand for construction of governmental facilities and buildings. And as a result, it is a small yet a hastily booming infrastructure market that has a great potential for increasing and developing. But yet again, there are still barriers for investment in countries of the South, like what Anstan said as well, competition. Countries of on the south of the Mediterranean are closer to Western countries. They are closer to the United States of America. They have historical ties, and they would prefer to cooperate with those countries rather than cooperate with China, which reduces China's competitive advantage in that sense. There's the external dependence of those countries on different countries of the world. There's the oil prices fluctuation. There's, of course, the terrorism, lack of interest of some countries to start active engagement with China. And these are actually challenges that China tries to face in order to foster more cooperation with countries south of the Mediterranean. If I would touch upon some of the aspects of China's approach to the north, it would be like an addition to what Anstas mentioned. Again, it's basically because China wants to access European markets, basically through the strategy of port and terminal acquisition development. China did not only gain acquisition of Piraeus or Nautom in both Greece and Spain, but it also gained acquisition for Zeebrugge and Antwerp in Belgium. It gained acquisitions of Rotterdam in Netherlands. It gained acquisitions of Vado in Italy, and of course in Nautom, which operates in Valencia and Bilbao, and of course Piraeus again. So this persistent and heavyweight approach scares actually and alarms Europe. Europe is concerned that this economic influence and control of China of its ports would actually extend to political influence, meaning that when China has access to European economies in that sense, they would be able to change Europeans' perception toward China, and in the future, push European countries to actually support China's interest and change their view about China's political system and economy, and in the end, actually achieve China's interest. And that is why, like the French President Macron has warned against that and asked for more European regulations to limit this foreign acquisition of ports in Europe. Yet again, you could always find a common ground to cooperate with China as Europe. China and Europe could actually find a way to face the challenges that they both face in the countries of southern Mediterranean. They could work together on facing terrorism, extremism, the region instability and turmoil that reflects on countries of the north of the Mediterranean. And they could also deal with the problems that actually makes Europe afraid from China. Like it's the insistence of Europe on protectionism, like the quality standards and regulations that China doesn't usually meet, and they could negotiate on that. And of course, China's insistence on using its labor and its investment companies in business in Europe. So finally, my concluding remarks. I would say that what I believe is the main characteristics of China's approach to countries of the Mediterranean is that, in general, it follows a customized bilateral approach, meaning that China would approach countries of the Mediterranean in a bilateral manner. It doesn't have a general strategy that applies to all countries of the MENA region or the southern Mediterranean. It works on complementing, as I said, the national development plans of those countries with the Belt and Road Initiative foundations and goals, and they come up with a kind of agreement on what achieves the win-win situation, what achieves the benefit of both both sides. China's approach to countries of North Africa could be termed the Business Economic Peace Promoter. It's a kind of acronym that I've developed, the BEEP, because China usually wants to because China is usually task-oriented. It's jumps directly to business and economics. It wants to establish peace and end conflicts in the region in order to maintain stability, and which would enable it to implement the Belt and Road Initiative in the proper manner that it wants. Its approach is devoid of conditionality. They don't care, again, about human rights or like that. They don't condition countries based on the situation of human rights. They don't condition countries based on the nature of their political system. They don't require countries to be democratic or to follow certain rules. They advocate their model, but they do not moralize it. They would prefer their system to be a blank canvas for the countries to write whatever they want on it, rather than imposing a certain model on them. Yet this approach is not unique to the region, to this region. This is how China approaches most of the countries of the developing world, and it's not something that we would say Mediterranean. So is it Mediterranean? Can we say that it has certain Mediterranean characteristics? Well, yes, if you would say that it's Mediterranean with Chinese characteristics in that sense. And last but not least, can we say that China's approach to Egypt is representative to China's approach to the countries of the southern Mediterranean? Well, I would say to an extent, but not really, not completely, because Egypt is a standalone country. It has its own peculiarities and its own specifics. You cannot really generalize China's approach to Egypt as its approach to the countries of the southern Mediterranean, because if you look at the countries of the southern Mediterranean, you would find that Libya, for instance, is unapproachable, faces extreme, there's no clarity, there's no transparency. The nature of the political system is not obvious, so Libya is out of the equation. Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia are countries that are closer to Europe. They follow similar regulations and similar procedures, so China's approach to them is different than its approach to Egypt. So we cannot really say that Egypt is a representative to the rest of the southern Mediterranean. And in the end, I thank you so much for your attention and looking forward for your feedback. And I would love to hear whatever you have. Thank you.
To end this panel, I introduced Jordi Quero, my good friend Jordi, who is lecturer of international relations at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra and also at IBE, and he's quite much involved in these issues of China and these emerging global actors in the Mediterranean. So Jordi, now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, appreciate it. Thank you so much, Lourdes, for having us here. Me. Sorry. As Lourdes has just mentioned, I'm a teacher of international relations of the Middle East, and as she has shared with us, I keep on hearing this question on what is the role of China in the region, what can we expect from China in the region, et cetera, et cetera. So what I plan to do here is, well, I'm not going to provide solid answers on that because I don't think that we can have those answers, but I would like to share with you what are the questions I make myself in relation to the role of China in the region. And through those, I'm going to try to provide you some insights on what they are doing and what we can expect from them in the region. Obviously, all of this done from an IR perspective, that this is where I come from. So consequently, I'm going to structure this short 20 minutes like speech in those 4 questions. I'm going to ask myself 4 questions that are going to structure my whole speech here. The first question I keep on asking myself is about the nature of the Chinese involvement in the region. So what are we actually talking about? What is the nature of China's involvement in the Middle East and North Africa region? Basically, the first thing that we have to pay attention, and the main thing that we have to pay attention, is about the Chinese involvement, the Chinese economic involvement in the region. And I would say that this is basically based on 3 different pillars that have been mentioned by both of my colleagues, but I've structured this idea as I said, in 3 different pillars. The first one that has been not really mentioned here, but it's really important to the Middle East, especially to the Gulf, it's energy. So Chinese economic involvement in the region, it's based on energy relations. Since 1993, energy became a net energy importer, and this is really, really important. And since then, so since 1993, around 50% of its oil comes from the Middle East. So we are saying that the Chinese economy is partially based when it comes to energy on top of the Middle East. The second main pillar of its economic relations with the region is about manufactured goods. China is not only a net importer China is not only an importer, but also an exporter of many, many different things to the region, and this is something that generally has been neglected, especially to the Gulf. Many low manufactured goods are exported to the Gulf, and this is the second part of the dimension. And the third one, the third pillar, is about something that has been mentioned before, and this is about infrastructure and construction. So this is the third pillar. It goes beyond the One Belt and One Road initiative, because we can see a lot of Chinese companies working on the region on what has been called by many people cheap and fast formula. So they are based on cheap and fast formula on construction. From 2010 to 2016, for instance, the statistics are only a bit, take them with a pinch of salt, but in those 6 years, China obtained contracts worth around $60 billion in the Gulf, just in the Gulf. Some really important examples are the local train in Mecca that was constructed by Chinese companies, the pipeline, the famous pipeline connecting the United Arab Emirates to the Indian Ocean, the one that was highly controversial, was also constructed by Chinese company, and all in all gives us the idea that, well, infrastructure and construction companies is also really, really important when it comes to Chinese relations to the Middle East. My conclusion in that respect on the nature of Chinese involvement in the region is that, well, China likes a lot the Middle East largely public economies. They deal really well with economies that are highly controlled and by public entities, by public institutions, because it's easy for them to run business in the way they like it. Consequently, what I'm saying here is that if they have this economic involvement we have described over the last hour or so, what is China afraid of in the Middle East? Well, mainly what any other investor is afraid of when it comes to economy, and these are instability. Instability is critical when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to Chinese foreign policy towards the region. It's something that they are scared of, that is something that worries them a lot. The second question I ask myself, and it's a consequence of these first thoughts I've shared with you, is this rather different than what we have seen from the US? So is this nature of the involvement of China in the region different from the American involvement in the region? We keep on hearing about this narrative of the end of the Pax Americana in the region, that the US is pivoting towards Asia, so someone is going to fill the vacuum. Russia is filling the vacuum in Syria. China is going to come to fill the vacuum. So I want to share with you some of my thoughts, in terms of to what extent what we are seeing of China is really, really different from what the US has done traditionally towards the region. The most important idea that comes to my mind in that respect is that the US has never neglected the political dimension of their relations with the region. Most of the relations that the US has carried out with the countries in the region are fully based on the political dimension of this type of connections. While as we have said before, and all over this last hour, China seems to be so focused on economics that it kind of neglects the political dimension. For me, this broader idea can be divided in two different parts that are really, really important to understand what are the ups and downs of Chinese foreign policy towards the region. The part one is that the US has invested a lot of money in security mechanisms in the region. The US, for the last 60 years or so, has been a net financial provider to the security mechanisms in place in the region. Obviously, we can ask ourselves, whose security? So that money that the US has invested in the region in security mechanisms, well, whose security is trying to advance? But long story short, the statistics are astonishing. The US, for instance, since the creation of the State of Israel in 1848, has provided around $118 billion to military assistance to Israel. It has done the same to Egypt since 1979 Camp David agreements. From that point onwards, so for the last 30 to 40 years, the US has, has provided around $75 billion to Egypt in concept of military assistance. This means around $1.3 billion a year. $57 billion to Iraq since 2003, 14 to Jordan, 1.2 to Lebanon since 2006, 1.3 to Yemen since 2009. I'm showing you here a lot of statistics that shows the commitment of the US vis-a-vis the security mechanisms in place in the region, something that China is fully neglecting, is not participating in any way in advancing, protecting, giving continuity to those security mechanisms that, as we know, are one of the pillars of the regional order in the region. But the second part of this question on the US involvement in the region has to do with the big difference between the US and China has to do with the nature of the approach as well. Let me quote John Alterman, who's a scholar at Brookings. Yeah, Brookings. I just speak it up now. He says, quote unquote, China does not appear to have any global evangelization streak and seems to have no desire to persuade the world of the superiority of China's ideology and culture. What I'm trying to say here is that, unlike the US, China seems to have no civilizational mission. We are not foreseeing any similar, any civilizational mission like the ones we saw in the region, in place in the region for the last 300 years. First UK and France, later on the US. That means that we don't see a centrality on the centrality of the democratization agenda. Obviously, the democratization agenda is out of the equation in this case. But not only that, obviously, the agenda on individual rights and human rights, it's also out of the equation when it comes to Chinese foreign policy towards the region. This idea of evangelization in liberal values and in liberal rights is totally out of the equation. And this is a big, big, big difference when it comes to comparing China and the US. This triggers, at least in my mind, the third question I ask myself. And the third question is that do these differences make China more appealing to the countries in the region? So not including the political dimension, not trying to persuade the countries in the region towards a specific ideology makes China more appealing in any way to the countries of the region, to the societies? Obviously, the answer to this question is, well, depending to who. If we talk about states as one single entity, or at least about the elites, many of the elites of those states, taking into consideration that we're talking about many dictatorial regimes, there are some things that are appealing. When it comes to growth, China is really appealing. For those elites, China is kind of an example of continuous growth that they want to imitate, especially if we take into consideration the economic problems that those countries are having and those countries are facing. So in that respect, China is seen like something that you would like to see yourself in, so something you want to mimic yourself. Also, when it comes to unemployment, the way China seems to manage unemployment, and this is a big issue in all the Middle Eastern economies, it seems that China is kind of appealing. But besides that, and for me, as an IR scholar, this is far more important, China has something that it's far more appealing to the countries. And this has to do with some of the basic conceptions of Chinese foreign policy. Chinese foreign policy, all in all, when it comes to, the broader Chinese policy, is mainly based on what we call at some point in history the five principles of peaceful coexistence, the five principles of Pacific coexistence. We have to go back to Bandung, 1955, to find the elaboration of those principles. But the most important among those principles is the principle of non-interference. So non-intervention principle, non-interference principle is key to understand Chinese foreign policy. This is really appealing to the countries of the region who have faced the penetration of the system for the last 60 or more years from Western superpowers, first the UK and France, and then the US. From a regional perspective, that might mean no more humanitarian interventions, so no Iraq 2.0, no Libya 2.0. This might mean no more human rights agenda in the region. This might mean do whatever you want. Obviously, this is appealing. China neglects the political dimension, neglects any political conflict, and portrays itself as advancing a win-win cooperation that is out of the political sphere, and this is highly appealing to most of those regimes. They are going to put to an end what they see as the foreign interventions in the region. To the societies, when it comes to the societies, I'm not sure that China is so appealing, or the Chinese approach is so appealing. And why is that? Well, basically, I think that it's fair to claim that most of those societies have been fully socialized in American values to some extent. So if you check the polls on values in those societies, some of them show high rates on liberal rights and liberal values. So in that respect, China is kind of a test to the continuity of the soft power of the US in the region. Is the Chinese model going to challenge or undermine to some extent the values set by this soft power approach to the region? This train of thought allows me to jump into the final question, the fourth one. The fourth question I ask myself. And this is, well, is this type of Chinese involvement in the region sustainable over time? This apolitical approach only based on economics can be sustainable over time? And here I would like to share my intuition, and my intuition is that no, this is not sustainable over time. And I have two different paths to reach that conclusion. Not two different reasons, but rather two different ways of reaching the same conclusion. The first one is that you cannot free ride on US investment on military assistance, security mechanisms in the region sine die. At some point, free riding on those security provided by the US and paid by the US is going to pay back. Would then China assume further responsibilities in security mechanisms in the region? Now, they can only neglect that dimension because the burden is assumed by the US. But this is only dependent on US willingness to pay that price. At some point, the US might say, hey, I'm not going to pay for the burden, you are free riding on this, get involved in security, and then, they have to change this Pacific coexistence approach, non-interference, etc., etc., etc. This is one train of thought, this is one path for arguing that this is not sustainable over time. But the second one, that is far more interesting from my perspective, is what so many people has called, and I would like to call as well, the colonial trap. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, if we pay attention to colonialism, to the history of colonialism, Western colonialism worldwide, it seems that we kind of accept that colonialism was only based on the civilizational mission. Colonialism was based on the idea of superiority of Western societies, Western values, evangelization, blah, 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 blah. So all those Western powers were willing to shape external societies in their image because they thought that their own values and identities were something to be imitated. But this is kind of misreading history. This is only part of colonialism. Some colonial endeavors, specifically the Dutch colonial endeavor, and to some extent the initial British colonial endeavor, was not initiated, was not triggered by this civilizational approach. But rather, the trigger point was something totally different. Initially, the Dutch and British colonialism came after initial steps by Dutch and British companies in the colonial societies, meaning private companies reach those parts of the world, they start developing business, and at some point they face some difficulties vis-a-vis the local societies and the local authorities. At that point, they turn back to the metropolis and say to their governments, hey, we are facing some troubles in the countries that we are conducting our economic relations. Why don't you come to help us in those countries? Because otherwise, we are going to lose this economic interest in these specific countries. At that point, the British and the Dutch start sending military troops to protect those private economic interests in those countries, etc., etc. What I'm trying to say here is that even if China has not this mission, this civilizational mission, you can also get involved into foreign contexts just to protect previously created economic interests by your own companies. China might see itself in the position to be forced to increase its political and military commitment to the Middle East to protect already present Chinese companies and Chinese interests in the region. The way that we read history seems to contradict this argument, but I think that this is misreading history. Just to conclude, I think that, I don't know if you like chess and if you play chess, but there is this fantastic word in chess that is suwang. Suwang, it's a position in chess where one of the players knows that by moving a piece, its position becomes worse. So you are forced to move, because obviously this is the chess rule, but any move that you make is going to put you in a worse situation than the one that you have at the beginning of your turn. What I could argue is that China in that respect may be in a Swan position dilemma. In the midterm, the region might pose China in a Swan position where any involvement willing to protect its economic interest might clash with its non-interference narrative that is the key to its contemporary current foreign policy in the region. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordi. Thank you. I think there have been three different approaches, very complementary to each other. And now, before giving the floor to all of you, I would like to first give the floor to Irene Martinez, who is researcher at CIDOP, at Barcelona Center for International Affairs, and who has kindly accepted to be the first discussant in this panel. So, Irene, if you want to make your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. The three of you has been very interesting, I think very complementary, and the visions have somehow intermingled. Actually, I would like to start already making a couple of comments and then maybe asking some questions. I would actually start talking about China and also a very important neighbor/competitor, which is Japan in the region. I think China, of course, has its own interest in the region. However, Japan has been there for mainly 50 years, not only in terms of like business, but also in terms of like development, and it has been very, very present. And particularly, I would actually like to mention that what you were actually talking about, the 5 pillars, it's interesting because Japan did actually have a very strong influence in terms of like ODA in Middle Eastern countries. However, it never actually participated in any kind of like political debate related to the countries. And actually an example is Egypt. Japan has more than 50 business in Egypt, and it's the 3rd main donor to the country. However, it has never been involved in the politics of the country. So, first question comes here. Could it be a pattern? Could it be that China is actually following a little bit what has been done from Japan and also South Korea in the region? Because South Korea has also been involved in the region, mainly regarding Iran and the Gulf as well, especially in infrastructure projects. So that would be the first question. Then I would also like to talk about the current involvement of China in the Gulf, especially regarding the Vision 2030 of Saudi Arabia, because it's something that it has not been publicly mentioned, but it's well known that China does have a stake in the vision of Saudi Arabia for 2030, and it has been actively participating in the talks. So it's something that it's not well taken by the authorities in the country, in Saudi. However, they do have a capital leverage and a political leverage right now. So in the short to medium term, do you think that this leverage is going to be present in Egypt and in the Balkans? Do you think that China is going to use this leverage? Because to me, these two presentations looked a bit like a free meal. So China is basically investing in the countries, but for what purpose? Because investing just in infrastructure to pass their own goods sounds a bit too much. So that would be too much, especially having in account, like taking in account that China has the China-Pakistan economic corridor already, that it's been developed for the last 15 years, that it's working. So what is the short to medium vision of China, especially regarding these areas? And does it actually collude to the vision of EU in these areas? You actually, Anastas mentioned a little bit briefly the EU's problems or issues regarding China involvement. What would be the same thing for Egypt or in general in the region? And then lastly, I would like to have like a general overview of like until which extent will China be able to actually accommodate the different projects that it has already running independently to the BRI. So the Shanghai Economic Cooperation, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, already some Eurasian initiatives that are particularly to specific countries, also Egypt's plan. So would it be able to accommodate all the different initiatives, projects, organizations under the umbrella of BRI, or would have so many transactional costs for China that in the end will have to actually focus on a particular initiative? Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you for a very rich comment in a very short time. So, do you want to start answering Irene's comments?
I think if you don't mind, I'm going to take the first one on Japan. So the question was about can China follow the pattern that Japan kind of introduced into the region in the last, or has introduced into the region in the last 40 years or so? My intuition is that no, that China cannot follow that pattern. And to me is that you can only sustain that non-involvement model to an extent. And this extent is that, I mean, you can only do that if you can assume that the cost of losing that investment. If what is at stake is something that you cannot renounce to, you're going to be forced to do something that goes beyond the win-win, blah, blah, blah. To me, even if the Japanese investment in the region has been, as you mentioned, really important, I'm not sure that can be fully compared to what seems to be the plans of China for the region. So if you put all your chips in the Middle East, I mean, you cannot then go back and say, okay, I'm not going to deal with the situation in the region because the cost of losing that investment goes beyond what you can assume as an investor, especially if you have the capability. I'm not sure that Japan at any given point would have had the capability of playing a political role in, I don't know, dealing with some of the conflicts in the region, in trying to bring stability into the region. But if you are China, with the whole military and political capabilities that you have at the international community, why are you going to renounce to use them if you see that some of those great investments are at stake? So you have the capabilities, the investment is so strong that you cannot renounce to it. I'm not sure that you can maintain this non-involvement model to an extent. For me, and I'm partially a historian, in my education I was formed as a historian as well. It seems to me that this discussion that we're having here is kind of similar to the one that the US faced in the late 40s, early 50s, when it was deciding what to do with the Middle East after the British were planning to get out of the whole region. So after Suez, 1956, especially in the discussions in the first Lebanese Civil War, 1948, the situation in Jordan, in Iraq. It seems to me that initially some of the arguments were pretty similar to the ones that the China is putting forward at this point. So no, we don't want to be like the ones who were here before us. But at some point they realized that their interest and their commitment needs to be there in order to protect their own interests that were already established in the region.
Yeah.
Thank you for the comments and the questions. Let me try to address them in a particular order. The leverage and the free meal argument, I mean, it's a very important discussion, and I try to address it. What are the Chinese motivations? Of course, it's never mere altruism, and it's never just the wish to contribute to the development of others as a benign motive. There are, of course, selfish motivations on the side of China. Usually what is said is the exporting overcapacity of the construction industry. So the Chinese basically development model, especially in the aftermath of the crisis, is heavily reliant on investment in infrastructure domestically and now also abroad. And basically there's as much highways, as much buildings you can build in China. And all these SOEs need to have projects. And one way to give them projects is send them to the Middle East, the Balkans, Africa to build something. But this is also relates to the overheating of the steel sector, for instance, and other sectors in China, which is kind of a simplistic argument in my interpretation because it has some truth to it, but basically this is not a way you can simply handle overcapacity. My understanding is that there is a bit of a deeper logic behind this whole change of approach and this whole Belt and Road and what China is doing in the regions in question. And that is basically China positioning itself as a stakeholder in their development with the idea to boost their markets, but with that to boost their ability to buy advanced Chinese goods. So China is upgrading up the value chain. So it's no more textile, it's no more cheap electronics, it's high-speed trains, it's satellites, 5G technology, smart cities, very advanced goods which are also very expensive. And China wants to sell these things, but they cannot sell them to poor countries. So in a way, there is interest to provide impetus for development, to provide to generate some activity and to create conditions for, of course, again, not altruism, very much interest. But this is kind of transcending the zero-sum logic in the sense China has been rising by being deeply embedded in global political economy. And it knows that it can only benefit only if others also get rich. In the phase of export orientation, they're really dependent on the capacity of the West to basically buy cheap Chinese goods. So this is the mentality. They know that China can only thrive if the world thrives. And again, this is not altruism, this is self-centered, but it's a kind of a different logic to everything else we hear. EU vision, I can talk mostly about the Balkans because I'm not a Middle East or North Africa expert. What is the EU vision in the Balkans? I mean, there is now a lot of buzz in the news, but there is also a lot of criticism because the latest statements from Brussels is, you know, people in the EU are more enthusiastic about EU itself. And the first date for accession is 2030 of the countries that are not members in the EU yet. And recently, the EBRD had to me, that's the most important thing is economic catching up. And EBRD issued a report recently, and they provided 3 scenarios for the Balkans catching up with Europe. And according to the most optimistic scenario, if these Balkan countries manage to restore pre-crisis growth rates, they can only catch up with the EU in 2053. If they maintain some average growth rates, they can catch up with the EU in 2070 something. If they maintain current post-crisis rates, they can catch up with the EU in 2 centuries from now. So in a sense, yes, there is EU vision for the Balkans in terms of governance, whatever, but everything is in question when you have such very dire economic condition. And in that sense, the optimism about China and this complementarity. Of course, the debt trap, for me, is the most important thing. I think I briefly mentioned it, is something that has to be discussed. Currently, there is mild threat that getting too many Chinese loans may provide the challenge of how you pay them back. Because the idea, at least the Chinese concept, is you borrow from the future, right? China gives you money, you hire a Chinese company, you build a highway, and then this highway helps generate economic activity, profits, whatever, and then you are able to pay back. But what if this highway is not profitable? And that poses another question, which I didn't have time to discuss enough in the presentation, but the question of agency of these countries. You know, you have to have a concrete economic strategy, and you have to know why you approach China. You cannot just get random projects. You have to have a strategy why you really need this and what you're going to do with it, because the world has changed. Highways are a very costly thing, and you have to make good sense out of it. Very quickly, Japan. It has not been an important actor, at least in the Balkans, but interestingly, it's coming now. So very recently, Abe had a tour through the extended Balkans. He went to Romania, he went to Serbia, Bulgaria, where he actually discussed establishing Japan-Balkans cooperation platform, which was then perceived as a kind of a competition with China. And I have a quick comment actually on the security issue. And I very much like that you brought the non-interference, the 5 principles of coexistence, because I skipped the ideology part in my presentation. I was going to also mention something about it, but for me, I think one thing that can help resolve the dilemmas and maybe further the debate is if you emphasize actually the underlying idea of the 5 principles, that is sovereignty. Because non-interference is, And I think if you see the case of Pakistan now and the security arrangements to protect Chinese investments can shed light on how it may develop in the Middle East. I'm, again, not an expert on any of these places, but I follow Chinese foreign policy. And I think what matters in the Chinese approach is that there is government-to-government deal. It doesn't matter who's in power, and once there is a deal, this can be also in military cooperation. That's again, this seems contradictory to the outside, but in that value system makes sense. That's also the logic for the Djibouti base, because there is, again, that also makes me ask the question, so how is this different from the US? Because the US also had bilateral consent. Anyway, I think it's very worthwhile, and I just wanted to chip in.
If you would allow me to just give a few comments and try to answer the last couple of questions about leverage and to what extent China can accommodate most of its projects. Well, I believe in the issue of leverage. Yes, definitely, China would have leverage on a country like Egypt with the extensive and the expansive amount of projects that it's having and investing in the country. And the amount of leverage that it would have on Egypt depends on to what extent Egypt is ready to play a role and understand, like what Anstas has been mentioning about what it really wants from its cooperation with China, and how does it view its role in the region, and how does it view its regaining its influence and agility and flexibility in regional context. So if Egypt would just comply and be content with its low profile, low influence on the region, low leverage, then there would be extensive amount of leverage on the policy of the country. But if Egypt starts to hop up a little bit and move beyond its economic difficulties that it's facing and start to actually become proactive and introduce kind of policies and suggestions and provide China with some insights on topics, for instance, like Syria, on negotiations or ideas in resolving the conflicts maybe and the like Cold War kind of situation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, if it starts to introduce its own capabilities in the cultural and ideological kind of dialogue between the Sunnis and Shiites, if it starts to look internally upon its own capabilities and abilities and what it can offer to China in return, I think the amount of leverage that would be exercised would diminish or be reduced to a certain extent. It would be more of a balanced kind of relationship between both parties. Yet, if it remains lost as it is currently in the situation, the leverage would definitely increase. If I move on to the issue of the accommodation of the projects, well, I believe China is just starting. China does not take a decision of starting a certain project or get involved in a certain initiative unless it has studied it extensively and for a very long time. They're very patient. They take their time in the decision. They study all aspects of the projects they're deciding to get involved in, and as a result, I believe the capacity of China to accommodate and control most of the projects it's starting to run all over the world. At this point of time, it can accommodate. I've heard Chinese people speak Arabic better than some of the Arabs. I have listened to their degree of specialization and understanding of the topics they are dealing with. They have extreme division of labor and extreme specialization on different aspects of their projects. So currently they can accommodate. But we understand from the stories of history that empires and countries, when they grow and they develop, I would not want to say that, to use the term greed, but empires tend to expand and expand and expand beyond their capacities. But I don't think China is in this stage at the moment. I think this will take some time to reach. But in the short term, I think they can accommodate the projects that they're evolving in to a good extent. Thank you.
On the leverage, I forgot to add, I think, yeah, there will be Chinese leverage, but it won't be a leverage to affect, let's say, general trajectory of development, or it will be limited to areas of China's interests, which are mostly particular projects, particular economic measures, and maybe core strategic interests. South China Sea, Taiwan voting in the UN, that's a given. But nothing in the sense, as Jordi was talking about, heavily influencing politics as other external players did, because for them that's actually creating more complications, more headaches. I don't know how it will be in the future, but for now, the only leverage will be just to pile up projects or to build upon what they have already.
Can I add something? Sure. There's something about specifically the case of Egypt, because I think kind of illustrates something that I've said before and illustrates something that is key to me. I'm a son of the American era, so maybe I'm kind of focusing way too much on the American role in the region. But to me, the leverage, for instance, the leverage that China has in Egypt is fully dependent on the will of the US. If tomorrow the US decides that stop paying for the $2 billion a year that kind of sustain the regime, they can turn Egypt into mayhem. They can turn Egypt into chaos. Obviously, this is kind of one of the pillars that sustain the political establishment of Egypt, and they can turn the country into, well, again, into chaos. Meaning, if you're sitting in Washington and you are seeing that China is the one taking the most out of Egypt, why are you gonna keep on paying for the bill? At what point in Washington people is gonna start asking themselves, well, do we have to continue what we initiated in 1979 if the most benefit country in the world is the one that we are competing for in the rest of the world? Are we gonna pay that bill? I think that consequently, the leverage and the position of China is still highly dependent on the willingness of the US to keep on paying for part of that bill. If the day arrives that the US at least challenges this, China will have to take some important decisions on the continuity on this only economic-based foreign policy.
Can I just comment on what you said? Do you remember what happened with the US and Pakistan? What the US has said? You know about taking back the military aid that they had from Pakistan, and the reaction of Pakistan was actually saying, like, okay, you can leave. We have China here that is willing to actually take the lead of this. So I actually wonder if there's already some cases, not particularly in the Middle East, but maybe in the wider region, of this happening already. Okay. And it's actually interesting because the first reaction in Washington regarding this issue was actually blaming Pakistan for not being outspoken and asking for getting back the aid. Should I repeat it all? Yeah? No. Okay.
So basically, if you mind, I'm going to try to... Basically, I think that the example that you're pointing to is kind of backs my argument in the sense that at some point, China is going to have to jump into the political and security dimension and go beyond this win-win narrative that puts only emphasis into the economic dimension. Yeah. So the Pakistani example, I have to admit, I didn't know it, kind of points towards the same direction I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
I think Eduard also wanted to comment. Just as you said, Yusra, back in 1994, I remember sharing classes of Arabic with Chinese students at that time, and I didn't really understand what the hell they were doing there because it was really difficult. If it was difficult for me to learn Arabic, for them it was a whole world difficult. And, you know, they were very good at that. And they were very perseverant. And I don't know if that was already a part of the strategy, but they were already. There were also some Japanese, but I must confess they were not so good. Chinese were much better.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on China, but I'll try to challenge some of the assumptions that we have on the table. The first is that the non-interference or to reduce the political involvement to conditionality. And in fact, what we see is that by not intervening, or in some cases by using some vetoes, there is a political intervention, there is a political statement there, there is a political involvement. I was not thinking that much about the Mediterranean countries of the Middle East, but others, like for instance Sudan, your neighbor, and there we can see a Chinese political involvement very clearly in supporting al-Bashir government, and then also taking stance on everything which related to Darfur. So, and there, Darfur, in that sense, interesting because then it's not only the maritime routes; it's something else. And we saw it more recently last year in Zimbabwe, also. I mean, a country very much dependent from China, and China in a way welcoming the ousting of Mugabe, which I would say as a precedent for other autocrats in the world who may be relying on Chinese support. So Bashir is one case. Mugabe is completely the opposite one. It means that perhaps you can rely as least to the Chinese support if things get wrong, as you may not rely also on the US support, which is one of the elements that erode the trust between the US and some of the traditional allies in the region. Then the other thing I was wondering is about the military involvement. No? Basically, we are talking about the military. So one of the things that we see, I mean, obviously, age distances from the US involvement in the region, but some presence. Djibouti, the fleet, we saw it first operation in Libya to rescue the nationals in Libya in 2011. So do you think that this is the trend? So that we will see also more robust military presence, and what could be interesting is a military presence that could be made in cooperation, because perhaps it will appear as less aggressive. I was thinking that there could be some complementarities or some synergies, for instance, with the EU in Somalia, in the Indian Ocean. That could be in the Red Sea as well. So that's also, I mean, we will see, I mean, more military involvement, although of a different kind. And then I think Jordi's comment on the fact that Chinese may be particularly happy when trying to invest in heavily public-dominated economies. I wanted to ask Yosra, linking with this idea, whether there has been a change of approach towards the Egyptian economy in light of what is happening right now. So we see also now, not only the state, but the army, which is even more disciplined than the state, taking over in many of those plans. I was recently in Egypt. I couldn't go to the administrative capital, although it was highly recommended to, because that's where you can see also the importance of the army, even as workforce. So in that sense, I want to ask you whether this militarization of the economy in Egypt right now makes the Egyptian economy more attractive to the Chinese than what the Egyptian economy was to everyone else in the late 2000s. because in the late 2000s we saw the boom of foreign direct investment in Egypt, but it was mainly in that sense probably more Western, also Middle Eastern, investing on privatizations, bakshish of all sorts. So we had, in that sense, a completely different game, one in which I'm wondering perhaps whether the Chinese felt a little bit more lost. Now they have this interlocutor, the military. Is this easy? Does it explain also the trend that you've been describing?
And I will add my questions as well so that you can answer. No, I wanted, and that is very connected to what Eduard was saying. I was thinking to what extent Egypt welcoming strong Chinese investment, for example, in the new capital, is also a way of saying to former European investors, hey, there's plenty of fish in the sea, and if you're not coming, I'm finding different people, don't worry. It's like, for example, the deals that Egypt has, the arms deals that has made with Russia. It's a sort of saying, okay, if you are not selling that to me, I will find someone to do that for you. And I will not be missing. So this, I don't know to what extent this is also a sort of warning signal for European countries to say, hey, rush up, otherwise you will be out of the game. And at the same time, I wanted to ask you, to what extent these mega projects will have a real strong impact so that China can have some feedback or some counterpart of this primary investment that they have done. Because as we have seen in the Suez Canal expansion, the results have not been so promising as it was expected. So I imagine that if the Chinese are investing, it's because they are expecting to get something back of these investments. So they will try to sell these financial buildings. So this means that this implies that this new city capital needs to be boosted and needs to become something alive and prosperous. So to what extent there is this horizon of this new city capital boosting the economy of Egypt? And on the sustainability of China involvement, I think your arguments to say no, it's not sustainable, are very strong. But I am really scared because China has proved to make real what we thought was not sustainable. I mean, we thought that they could not open up economy and have such a wide stronghold in all the world's economy without opening up a little bit the political scenario, and we have seen that they have managed to do that perfectly well. So you gave strong reasons on why the US at the end will say, okay, no, that's enough is enough. But taking into account the delicate balances that are in the region, I'm a little bit scared that this no is more wishful thinking than reality, and we might stumble back in a wall of Chinese resilience into sustaining this undercover, because sometimes this Chinese presence is very, very, very visible in consumer goods in the region, but sometimes it's not so visible at the global eye as this strong economic investment. So I would say wishful thinking, yes, it has a deadline, but I'm a little scared to the capacity of resilience to adapt to the new context and survive with this strategy. So
let me try to share with you some of my thoughts and some of the comments made here. On the question that Eduard addressed on sovereignty and reducing political involvement to conditionality, for me, I think that there is an important one. I think that the way China understands the principle of non-interference, and as Anastas mentioned before, the principle of sovereignty itself, it's kind of based on the idea of do whatever you want, I'm not going to mess around, full stop. If that doing whatever you want means that you want to get rid of the leadership of your country, that's fine. If you want to keep it, that's fine. It's not kind of a status quo approach to sovereignty. It's kind of an observer approach. you can do whatever you want, I'm going to be here, but this does not mean that I'm going to defend the status quo. It's really different from the American perspective that we have been discussing for many, many years now on the principle of non-sovereignty, on non-interference vis-a-vis the status quo policies, et cetera, et cetera. As you said, well, we have seen examples like the mission in Libya where they are willing to participate and they actually participate, and this seems to be kind of contradictory with some of the things that we mentioned. Well, for me, I think that this is an answer to a very different question. Another whole dimension of Chinese foreign policy, it's about how they portray themselves as a responsible global superpower. And in those situations where we see a United Nations Security Council resolution going for the mission under Chapter 7, Article 42 of the Charter, et cetera, and they can portray themselves as a new global actor who's responsible towards the whole international society, they are for that. This might be understood as kind of a limit to the non-interference principle, but on the other way around, if we go back to international law, any international mission backed by the UN Security Council resolution does not go against the principle of non-interference. It's one of the exceptions. So in that respect, they fully respect international law. And when it comes to, let me jump to the second question on SWEF. Let me pick something really quick on SWEF. On the short term, the SWEF project didn't work because it didn't pay off directly. But if we understand that China, if we understand China as a state company, so the whole country as a company, and we do not only look at the specifics of that investment, but rather in the long term, what they can take out of that investment, from a Chinese perspective, I think that they didn't draw a lesson. They thought that even if they had to pay a price, in an investment price for SWEF, that was worth it, as this was going to open to them the European market. So it's like, in this specific project, I'm going to lose part of my money. I understand that this is not going to pay off directly, but as I'm a long-term actor, state company, it's going to pay off in the long run. So I don't see that they have drawn the lesson. And finally, on the sustainability, what I was trying to say is that what it is not sustainable over time is for them to keep this level of economic involvement without a parallel political and military involvement. It's not about that they are going to go back and say, hey, stop that, but rather at some point they are going to be forced to the position that, well, they will have to deliver some political and military aid.
Just a couple of brief comments. On the question of sustainability, I would go back to what I said in my previous round of discussion, that, I mean, the whole new strategy of China is actually a big bet, because they're actually betting that also others will perform up to the expectations. So when they go to the Middle East, when they go to the Balkans, when they deal with these governments, they actually accept the uncertainty. And this is, again, not out of sheer idealism or whatever, but it's very much how China has been rising into the global system, as I said. They know that it's this belief in interdependence, which you can relate it to Marxist thinking or just to the practical experience of China doing things. But China would have not been there where it is now if not for emerging in the global trade system and receiving investments and whatnot. So for them, this is something, a historical force, if you can put it that way. And in that sense, touching upon what you mentioned also, some of these investments are not driven purely by commercial logic. And some of these investments sometimes are clearly political in nature or have a very long-term perspective, something that maybe we not see. Because again, I wouldn't want to dwell and fall into the trap of very culturalist thinking, but just the nature of the Chinese system allows for a very much long-term planning, because there is no predicament of frequent government changes and whatnot, which relates to a different type of strategic thinking. We mentioned chess, but there's also the Chinese chess, or Wei Qi, and this again relates to a different logic where, you know, in that Chinese board game with stones, there is no absolute winner. You win when you secure 51% of available territory. So for China, the success is not absolute. Like in typical chess game, you have to kill the king. Yeah, you annihilate the opponent. In my thinking, at least for now, the Chinese strategy is to secure their interests and let others be. And this also gives insight into how they may behave towards US and other powers. So that's just.
I think that long-term idea makes a lot of sense. I mean, I was thinking, yeah, they have thousands of years of history. They can wait thousands of years more to get their feedback from the compensation for the investments.
Yeah. To just give quick answers for the couple of questions that have been directed to me. The first about militarizing the economy and to what extent this is a factor in attracting China to invest in Egypt. I would say that China doesn't really matter. It doesn't really care. It doesn't care who provides the economic conditions or facilitate the regulations for it to have proper investment in any country. So if it was the private sector that is making the environment more viable for investment, then welcoming it. If it was the military that is actually doing all the work, then to make the investing environment more stable and more acceptable, then let's be it. Conditionality doesn't matter. The type of political system doesn't matter. What matters is who does the business and who creates the job. And I would look at it in a sense. It's a two-direction kind of thing. It's not just militarizing the economy. It's actually economizing the military at the same time, because the economy in Egypt is not becoming militarized in a sense that it's different from how it was before. It's just like, who are the players that are involved in the economy? The military is trying to hegemonize most of the economic aspects in Egypt, but business is done as usual. It's just like he's not letting anyone else play with him. He just wants to play alone with his own regulations and with his own rules, which makes it difficult for different private sector companies to actually have a say or have a niche or anything in the economy. So it's more of economizing the military, because they usually outsource. They usually go to other private sector companies to do the jobs for them. Like, for instance, in the new capital, in the new administrative capital, all these nice drawings and all these nice plans are not done by military companies. It's like they outsource, and those outsourced companies, they work for the military. So is it a source of attraction? I don't think it plays that much of a role in like, for instance, if it was the private sector who's doing the same job, the Chinese would have come as well. To what extent that Egypt's welcoming Chinese investment is actually a flag for the Europeans? Well, yes, it definitely is. In previous regimes, during the regime of Nasser, during the regime of Sadat, during the regime of Mubarak, there was usually this ideological or some kind of thought or belief that controlled the regimes a little bit. Like Nasser was more socialist oriented, so he would prefer to deal with the Russians rather than the imperialist capitalist Americans and Brits. With Sadat and Mubarak, they were more American oriented and Western oriented, and they would be more focused on what the United States of America wants. So it was more of a kind of interest and kind of a belief kind of system. But with the current leadership, ideas and beliefs, and it doesn't matter. They don't care. It's very pragmatic and very like, who is going to save us from the situation that we're in? Who's going to provide us with the deals and the economic facilities that we need, regardless of who is it that is providing it? If it's the Russians, okay. If it's the Americans, fine. If it's Chinese, fine. So it's not a matter at all of who's offering it. Currently, it is said that Egypt is in the worst terms with the United States of America, despite the closeness between both leaders, Trump and Sisi. But still, it's not as it used to be before, because of this diversification of outreach, because of his, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's offering it, as long as it's being offered. So this is a change in the mindset of the Egyptian leadership, and it's something that is interesting, and even for us as Egyptian citizens. The mega projects, and what does China get from that? Well, most of the projects that China is involved in with Egypt are interest-based, are loan-based, it's like with certain installments on a very long period of time, for 15 years, for 20 years. So China is getting whatever it wants from the projects that is being implemented in Egypt with interest. So it's basically the Egyptian side that is in debt, is indebted in that sense. Is the one that we're concerned about how we're going to pay those debts in the future, concerned about the burden that it represents on our economy. The leadership doesn't see that as how I would see it. The leadership believes that the current long-term projects will pay off in the future. So we can handle, or we can carry the burden of the debts and the loans that we take now, because in the coming 10 or 15 years, it's going to pay off. Even though this might be what I think is in the benefit of my country, but this is what the leadership see, and it's just a matter of time. Then we will see if their ideas are the ones are going to dominate, or is it the other way around. So.
Okay, I think we are done. I think we had an excellent panel, an excellent ending panel for this seminar. So I really thank you all, thank the panelists, thank you that you have resisted until the end, and this is really brave, because it has been a quite intense day and a half. I was going to say a year and a half, because it seems that we have been organizing this for a year and a half. And I would like also to thank here particularly Brita and Nainara and Elisa, and all the colleagues at IEMed that have been helping us in the organization, because you said thank you for the good organization. It couldn't be possible without them, because they have been the ones holding the burden of the organization of the conference. And I hope to see you again very soon in this framework of this program, Aula Mediterrània, or in any other of the events of all the universities and think tanks that have been involved in this session and in this conference. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Barcelona. And thank you all again.